In this video, I present two movements from François Couperin's 17th ordre in E minor. La Superbe ou la Forqueray is the first movement, while the Courante is the fourth movement. There are 5 movements total, by the way. The Courante is the only official dance movement of the ordre, as all the other movements have descriptive titles. However, as La Superbe is really an Allemand, I thought it would be interesting to create a traditional pairing of the two movements, as in some respects their usual personalities are somewhat reversed here. As its complete title indicates, La Superbe is a portrait of the celebrated viola da gamba player Antoine Forqueray, while the word superbe can, like in English, denote something superb or magnificent. It also especially denotes someone who is arrogant, and as contemporary sources indicate, that was indeed one of Forqueray's defining traits. Couperin further amplifies this interpretation by instructing the performer to play proudly and without slowness. The piece is certainly full of grand gestures and contains stylistic elements that one finds in Forqueray's own music. These include a full texture with many imitative moments, the use of sequence, and a preference for the lower registers of the instrument. In fact, if you were to listen to Forqueray's own Allemande La Laborde from his first suite in D minor, you would notice many similarities in the way both pieces sound. And as Forqueray's suites were published simultaneously, both in their original form for viola da gamba and also transcribed for harpsichord, it is even easier to hear these similarities. Just keep in mind that Forqueray's pieces were published after his death by his son, and there's an uncertainty as to how much the son may have tampered with his father's music. Still, the resemblance of Couperin's La Superbe to what we know of Forqueray's music is unmistakable. Let me play the beginning of both pieces and see what you think. So here is the Allemande from Forqueray's first suite in D minor, entitled La Laborde, and for reasons that I will explain later, as you listen to it, also pay a little bit attention to how I phrase the left hand. I will explain later why I want you to do that. But listen to the whole piece, of course, but pay a little attention to the phrasing of the left hand. And now the opening of Couperin's La Superbe. Now going back to the two pieces from the 17th ordre that I'm going to be performing, I mentioned that in terms of their personalities, they display what could be seen as reversed personalities. Obviously, this is a generalization, but in many Allemande Courante pairs, the Allemande tends to be the more reflective and lyrical of the two, while the Courante is the more impulsive and extroverted one. These contrasting personalities can, of course, affect the phrasing and articulation a performer will choose, and also affect the registration. What I mean by this is that, at least for me, I tend to play allemands just in the lower manual and perhaps use the upper manual for the repeats, while for the courantes, I will couple the manuals. In other words, I will use both 8-foot stops. In this instance, since it is the allemande that is the more impulsive of the two, while the courante is more reserved and inward-looking, my registration is the exact opposite of what I normally use. So I couple the manuals for the allemande, and I use the single lower manual for the courante. And I also felt that the character of the allemande, coupled with Couperin's instruction to play without slowness, warranted a slightly faster tempo. Now, one final thing that I would like to mention, and this is why I told you to pay a little attention to what I did in the left hand, especially with the Forqueray piece, has to do with how we phrase the left hand in allemands, especially if you want them to swing a little bit. And of course, since they're dance movements, I think swinging is very, very appropriate. The same thing can happen in the courante, of course, but here, especially with French courantes, we're dealing with a certain difficulty, a certain challenge, which I will mention in a minute, which is why I'm not going to dwell as much on the courante. But what happens in many of these allemands is that, of course, the unit of the beat is the quarter note. Most of these are in 4/4 time. But what happens is that you will notice that we usually have a motion that tends to consist of eighth notes. I'm always talking about the left hand. This is very, very obvious in the Forqueray allemande that I played, La Laborde. And what I like to do is I like to think of the first of the two eighth notes, in other words, what happens on the beat. I try to keep that as long as possible and have it, let's say, bleed into the second eighth note, but then I lift the second eighth note much faster. So that what happens is you create, and if I go back to the Forqueray allemande for a moment, because as I said, it's a little more obvious, it's a little more, the motion is a little more regular in this piece. What I do is, if you have this kind of eighth note motion, what I try to do is, you will notice I try to keep the first note kind of bleeding into the second one. And then the second one I lift much faster, so that the final result will be something like this. And there's a trill there too. By the way, what you're hearing outside right now are the cicadas. We have a gloriously beautiful summer day. The cicadas are singing their heads off for the most part, and I don't think there's any way I can make this entire recording without them singing. So I'm sorry you have to hear them, but to me at least it's a very pleasant sound. It won't happen while I actually play the music, so don't worry. It's only affecting the introduction. So what I do is I try to do the same thing. Now the Couperin is a little less regular, but still you have this kind of motion, and of course you provide variety because obviously Couperin varies this kind of eighth note motion quite a bit. So there's variety there, and if I follow this kind of procedure, this kind of phrasing, now with the Couperin, the opening would sound something like this. So you give the piece a little more swing this way. And one other thing that I will mention here, and this is of course the most difficult part, is that if you do the exact same thing with the right hand, in other words, if you always lift both hands at the same time, then this is going to sound very, very rough. So then you actually lose the swing. And the most difficult thing to do, I would say, the greatest trick here is that when you're doing this phrasing in the left hand, don't imitate it exactly in the right hand. So obviously the right hand has a melody, so sometimes the melody is going to carry over these beats, and when it does that, make sure that you don't lift both hands at the same time, because then it's going to sound really harsh, it's going to be too obvious. And of course, especially with the harpsichord, where you really, the beauty of the sound has to do with resonance. If you interrupt the resonance at the same time, all the time, then this becomes a mannerism. So make sure that while you do this kind of thing in the left hand, you don't do it exactly the same in the right hand. Now, the reason I'm not going to tell you too much about the courante is that you can do the same thing. In other words, you can do the same type of phrasing, keeping in mind, of course, now that we have a different kind of dance, and where we connect and we lift notes is going to be in different places. But what happens in courantes, especially French courantes, is that composers are going to always be playing with phrasing that consists either of 2 notes or 3 notes. So we always have this contrast, this continuing contrast between groups of 2s and groups of 3s. So you have to be able to figure out where those groups are, and you also have to keep in mind that sometimes the right hand is going to do the opposite thing. So sometimes the right hand and the left hand are actually doing different groupings. So it's a very, very complex kind of texture, and to me that's where a French courante is so wonderful and actually has all of these different layers, because if you actually think about the phrasing and you try to bring out not just the different groups of 2s and 3s, but also the conflict between the 2 hands, then it becomes a very, very complicated piece. And I hope that you can actually hear some of this in my performance, especially as you're able to follow the score as well. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performances. Thank you.